I introduced myself the moment I stepped onto my porch in Denver, telling the cold air that I was Jordan Ellison and that I'd just come back from a 3-day assessment job in Aspen. But the only thing that answered me was the dead silence of a door lock that wasn't mine, as I stared at a fresh metal plate where my smart keypad used to be, and felt the first flicker of something wrong tightening across my ribs. When the door cracked open 2 inches, Evelyn's eyes appeared before anything else, and she whispered through the gap that she thought I wouldn't be home until tomorrow, while her hand braced the edge of the frame like she was holding back a stranger. I told her to open the door because this was my house, and I needed to know why someone drilled out my lock. But she murmured that I should not raise my voice because Riley had finally settled in and didn't need more stress tonight. Evelyn pushed the door open just enough for me to see Riley stretched across my sofa with a glass of red wine, and the stem tapped against the armrest when she turned her head toward me and asked why I was back early, with the casual ease of someone who believed the space belonged to her. My coat was still on my shoulders when Evelyn explained that Riley lost her studio lease and needed somewhere stable. And she added that my house made more sense for them than for me when I traveled so often. The line landing with the kind of certainty that left no room for my reaction. Riley lifted my throw blanket with her foot and said she hoped I didn't mind, because she'd already moved her wheel and clay tools into the spare room. And the sound of her comfort struck hard enough that I felt something settle in my chest like a warning bell. I told Evelyn to step aside so I could walk into my own home, but she shifted just enough to block the way while insisting that I take a breath and consider whether a hotel might be easier tonight, since Riley needed quiet to regroup. The smell of my own bergamot candle drifted past her shoulder as she mentioned they had already rearranged a few things to make space. And my breath caught when I noticed my bookshelf through the narrow opening, shifted out of alignment as though someone had dragged it without care. Riley called out that Denver rents were brutal and my place was a lifesaver. And the absolute confidence in her voice made the edges of everything sharpen until the porch felt too small to contain what was happening. I walked back down the steps because Evelyn had already closed the door, and the click of the new lock carried through the wood with a finality that hollowed the space around me. The winter air bit at my hands as I reached the sidewalk, and my mind replayed the exact tilt of Riley's smile. The kind people wear when they believe they've outmaneuvered someone who won't fight back. I stood there long enough to feel the truth settle, realizing the lock wasn't the only thing they replaced tonight. Because somewhere between Aspen and my front porch, my place in my own family had been rewritten without my permission. Evelyn pulled the door open just far enough for me to see the hallway light spill onto her shoulder as she told me I needed to understand that Riley had been through a brutal week and that someone in the family had to step up because letting her fall apart wasn't an option anymore. She added that a person with a stable income and a 2-bedroom townhouse shouldn't act overwhelmed by a little sacrifice. And the implication sharpened when she noted how empty my life looked each time she visited. Riley's laugh drifted from the living room as she called out that Denver landlords were ruthless and that losing her studio had shattered her. The tone so casual, it felt like she'd already rewritten the story of why she belonged here more than I did. I asked why my office door was open behind her, and Evelyn leaned closer to remind me that Riley needed a creative space, since rebuilding her portfolio was the only thing keeping her afloat. The plea dripping with the same urgency she always used when she believed guilt was the quickest way to get compliance. She pressed her hand against her chest as she explained that Riley hadn't slept in days, and that giving her a room was the least a sister could do when someone had been pushed to the edge, by circumstances no one could control. Riley chimed in that she'd already set her tools up and hoped I wouldn't mind because the light in that room was perfect. The kind of comment delivered by someone who assumed the decision was no longer mine. I stepped forward, and Evelyn blocked me again with a quiet reminder that I shouldn't escalate things because Riley needed calm energy tonight. Not confrontation from someone who didn't understand how fragile she was after the eviction. She added that I'd been gone so much lately that the house barely felt lived in. And there was a pause before she murmured that maybe this place had been waiting for a real sense of family to fill it. Riley shifted on the couch just enough for me to see she was wearing one of my knit cardigans, and the sight landed with the weight of confirmation that neither of them planned to treat this as temporary. I asked when they planned to tell me, and Evelyn glanced over her shoulder, as though calculating whether honesty would complicate the peace she was pretending to preserve, before mentioning that they thought letting me walk into a settled home would soften the blow. She told me they had spent the day moving things around so Riley could breathe, and she pointed out how considerate they'd been to keep most of my belongings untouched until we figured out the long-term layout. Riley stretched out her legs across the sofa and remarked that having a stable home again felt like she could finally exhale. And her comfort was so evident, it pushed the truth to the surface with unmistakable clarity. I backed away from the doorway, and Evelyn's voice followed me with a gentle plea not to make this harder than it needed to be, because my independence gave me options Riley didn't have. A comparison that landed with a familiar sting. She mentioned a hotel by Colorado Boulevard that I used before early work flights, and suggested I stay there tonight, so no one's nerves would fray further. The tone steady, as if she were arranging a simple favor rather than displacing me from my own address. Riley lifted her glass and told me she hoped I understood, and the casual ease of her toast traced a line straight through the last quiet part of me, leaving only the realization that they had already decided this was done without me. I returned to the townhouse at dusk with the same steady breath I used when walking into volatile risk sites. And Evelyn opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been waiting for confirmation that I'd finally accepted what she called the reality of our situation. She mentioned that she knew I'd come around because compassion always won in this family, and she gestured toward the kitchen where Riley lifted her mug and asked whether I wanted tea or space to cool off. I told them both that I had made a decision, and that if Riley was going to stay here, then staying had to be done correctly because liability didn't bend just because people shared a last name. Evelyn's shoulders eased as she asked what I meant. And I walked to the counter where my laptop was already humming from when I'd left earlier and explained that housing someone long-term required documentation to protect all parties, especially when the owner traveled as often as I did. Riley leaned forward with a hopeful grin when I mentioned a caretaker arrangement, and she asked whether the role included room, utilities, and some version of stability she could present to future clients in Boulder. I nodded and pointed out that the position came with insurance benefits and formal recognition as property staff, the kind of structure Riley had always said she needed to rebuild her work life after everything collapsed. I drafted the agreement with straightforward terms so they would read as generous rather than restrictive, and Riley murmured that being trusted with this responsibility meant more than she could express, while she shifted my cardigan around her shoulders like it was a uniform she was ready to earn. I added the clause outlining that occupancy existed solely as a condition of employment and watched Riley scan past it in search of numbers tied to compensation and hours, her attention settling only when she found the line about flexible scheduling. Evelyn touched Riley's arm and whispered that this arrangement restored dignity to everyone involved, and the praise rolled through the kitchen with a relief so tangible it almost obscured the way Riley didn't pause long enough to understand what she was signing. I printed the agreement, and the soft hum of the machine filled the corner of the room as Riley reached for the pen before I even slid the pages toward her. She commented that the title, Estate Caretaker, had a nice ring to it, and joked that maybe structure was exactly what she needed to get her life back on track. Her voice bright with the confidence of someone who believed she had just secured permanent ground beneath her feet. I remained still as she signed, watching the ink settle across her name with the quiet precision of a lock clicking into place. And when she passed the papers back to me with a satisfied smile, the balance in the room shifted just enough for me to feel the first turn of the trap closing. At the hotel on Colorado Boulevard, I opened my laptop and let the townhouse feed load across the screen while the hum of the heater filled the room. And the first thing I saw was Riley flicking ash from a cigarette onto my quartz counter, as if the caretaker duties she signed hours earlier had never existed. Mark leaned against the island with a grin, telling her that none of it mattered because the place was basically hers now, and that I would never push back hard enough to change that. Riley exhaled smoke toward the ceiling while murmuring that I'd always been predictable, the kind of person who followed rules even when those rules didn't serve me. I watched her walk to the front door and pull a stack of envelopes from the slot, and she whispered that she'd deal with them later, before shoving the entire bundle behind the pantry shelves where she thought no one would notice. Mark asked whether any of the mail was important, and Riley answered that everything addressed to her from Boulder was always trouble she didn't plan to face. She pushed the pantry door shut with her elbow, and the slight shake in her hand told me exactly how close whatever she was hiding was to boiling over. When she returned to the counter, she pulled out her phone and told Mark that the caretaker arrangement was a gift because it meant housing, a title, and the freedom to ignore the past she'd left behind in Boulder. Mark let out a low laugh and asked whether she thought I would ever try to reverse it, and she reminded him that the lease she lost had broken her in ways I didn't understand, which was why she intended to stay here until she rebuilt everything. Riley tapped ashes into a mug that used to hold my morning tea and said that Denver had finally handed her a clean slate, the kind of certainty that made the edges of the scene sharpen inside my chest. I zoomed in on the pantry as soon as she stepped away, and the frame tightened around the top envelope where the black print of a Boulder law office appeared clear enough to read. The return address carried the same firm name I recognized from a prior assessment case involving unpaid commercial rent, and the sight of it here connected every loose thread she tried to bury. Riley came back into view, holding a new glass of wine, and the false ease in her shoulders felt like confirmation that she knew exactly what those envelopes contained. As she settled onto my sofa and told Mark that I wouldn't dare disrupt someone who had nowhere else to go, I closed my laptop and felt the quiet of the room shift with the weight of everything she had just revealed. Mark's voice drifted through the speakers one last time as he teased her about landing on her feet yet again. And Riley answered that luck wasn't luck when you learned how to make other people's stability work for you. I powered down the feed, knowing the evidence she'd offered so freely was enough to pull the next lever, and the stillness that followed felt like the final moment before a door unlocks. The morning after watching Riley hide the Boulder envelopes, I drafted a short termination notice on my hotel desk and sent it to the caretaker email address she listed. And my phone buzzed almost instantly with her message demanding to know what I thought I was doing because she'd barely settled in. I read her line insisting that employment didn't change the reality of her needing a home, and I answered only with the clause number that made occupancy contingent on active work status. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel like the moment right before glass fractures, and it carried all the way through the next notification from the house system, confirming that the thermostat had been locked at 50 degrees and the refrigerator access panel disabled. Within minutes, Riley appeared on the feed in a sweatshirt pulled tight around her neck as she yelled toward the hallway that this was illegal and that no one could freeze her out of a place she'd already made her own, the rage in her voice shaking as her breath fogged in the air. Mark stomped into the frame asking what she expected when she never read anything before signing it. And Riley snapped that the agreement was obviously a formality, because no one with a conscience would weaponize a job title against their own sister. He grabbed his jacket and muttered that he wasn't getting dragged into another Boulder rerun, and the door slammed behind him with a finality that left Riley alone in a room she suddenly didn't know how to hold. I watched her pace across the living room while barking into her phone that I needed to pick up because she wasn't leaving. And her voice cracked when she shouted that losing this place would ruin her the same way everything else had. Evelyn stepped into the frame asking if she should call me to mediate, and Riley told her that I was being dramatic and that a simple conversation would fix everything if I stopped pretending the contract mattered. Evelyn tried to reassure her that I'd calm down eventually, but the tremor in her hands matched the tremor in Riley's breath, and the space between them closed with the unease of two people who realized the ground under their feet was shifting. The knock on the door came an hour later, and the feed showed Riley freezing mid-step as a process server announced her name through the wood with the firm cadence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Evelyn urged her not to answer, but the second notice included the line authorizing service by presence, and the envelope slid into view as Riley murmured that this couldn't be happening again. When she tore it open and the Boulder case number appeared, her knees buckled just enough for Evelyn to grip her arm, and the panic in both their faces carried through the lens like a tide breaking. I ended remote access as Riley screamed at Evelyn to pack what she could, because staying would make everything worse. And the feed caught the frantic blur of movement as they stuffed bags without looking back at what they left. The last frame showed the front door swinging open with a sharp jolt before the system confirmed their departure. The townhouse returning to stillness the moment the lock clicked behind them. I closed my laptop knowing the collapse had finished itself. Not with a confrontation, but with the weight of consequences Riley had invited the moment she signed her name. When I returned to the townhouse that afternoon, the air inside held the stillness of a place waiting to be reclaimed. And the faint trace of cold told me the thermostat had finished its work long before Riley and Evelyn rushed out. I walked through each room with slow, deliberate steps, and the quiet settled deeper when I whispered that everything they moved would be put back the way it belonged. The cleaning crew arrived an hour later, and one of them remarked that the house looked like someone had tried to reinvent it in a hurry, a line that fit the scattered items left behind without needing any embellishment. I stood in the doorway of my office as they worked, and the sight of my rearranged shelves tugged at the exact spot where Riley's tools had been crammed against my books just days earlier, the imbalance still visible in the scuff marks along the floor. When the lead cleaner asked whether I wanted the room restored to its original setup, I told her to reset every piece of furniture because intention mattered even when no one else saw the correction. The rhythm of her crew moving quietly through the space let me breathe in a way I hadn't since stepping onto my porch that first night. By late afternoon, the townhouse felt structurally sound again, and I changed every code on the smart lock with the same calm I used when preparing high-risk assessments, the keypad lighting up beneath my hand as if acknowledging the shift. I stood in the entryway and murmured that the manual deadbolt had served its purpose, then removed it and set the hardware aside for recycling, the metal clicking softly against the cardboard box. The hum of the HVAC returned to its usual warmth, and the living room lights glowed with the steady reassurance of a system no longer being contested. When I finally sat on my sofa, the fabric held none of Riley's imprint anymore, and the quiet wrapped around me with the clarity of something long overdue. Evelyn called once and left a message asking for a conversation, but I let the phone fall silent because the line she crossed had already told me everything I needed to know. I leaned back against the cushions and whispered that peace wasn't won by forcing anyone out, but by refusing to surrender the space where my life began. And the truth of it settled as gently as the evening light moving across my floor. I want to thank you for staying with me through this story, because sharing it helped me breathe in ways I didn't expect. If any part of it echoed something in your own life, I hope you feel less alone in the quiet moments afterward. And if you choose to subscribe, I'd love to have you here while I keep rebuilding toward steadier days.